If we flip the pages of time, which cake can you think about that might be forgotten today? Let's refresh our memory of sweet treats by going over forgotten cakes from the 1970s. Starting our list off with the Harvey Wallbanger, which has a ridiculous story behind the name and a taste one can remember for a lifetime. Much different from the types of cakes that were typically served in the 1970s, the cake broke new ground in the baking scene by trying to copy a cocktail. Harvey Wallbangers were a really popular cocktail made of vodka, orange juice, and an Italian drink known as Galliano. Usually the base would just be a basic cake mix, and what you had then was simply in its own league. Look, lots of cakes are good, but this one had its own style and flair like no other did in the 1970s. Wallbanger cocktails being a top order at bars only helped with that. A fragrant, boozy orange cake that is soft and airy, it was one of the most treasured recipes that we lost to the 70s. Watergate cakes were another hit dessert in the 1970s, particularly in 1972 when the Watergate scandal occurred. A Watergate cake is a layer cake made of pistachio and often has mousse frosting, although it can contain other ingredients too, like diced pineapple and marshmallows. Despite its questionable political rep, it actually was popular enough in 1975 to increase shortages for pistachios all around Washington. That too near Christmas season, folks were baking. That many of them, but we bet you have never heard of a Watergate cake before. Sadly, it is a forgotten relic gone from tables nowadays. Modern-day Christmas cakes look like lots of ice or vanilla frosting, and the pistachio flavor is not too much of a hot pick in the baking industry. Still, we definitely would have loved to try a slice of this green-colored beauty. Good thing we mentioned beauty, since a tunnel fudge cake is a great example of a cake one simply cannot pass up on. Not in the same elegant and aesthetic way as a Watergate, but in a way that awakens your primal desires to consume food. A good, freshly baked tunnel of fudge could send people into a daze where their bank balance did not matter. Of course, there would be the little voices in the back of a person's head saying, "You don't need all of that," but the delicious chocolate aroma would take care of those pretty quick. Entirely a chocolate cake down to the last crumb, with a sweet choco fudge on the inside and a thick glaze on the outside. This was the dream. Bundt cakes like this one were already popular in the 70s, but the tunnel of fudge took the spotlight, but not for too long. As a few decades went by, these cakes became very outdated. Sock-it-to-me cakes were probably the vanilla lover's equivalent to a tunnel of fudge. Just like the former, everything about this cake amplified the sweet vanilla flavor. In the 1970s, buttery elements in desserts were really common, and most pastries, cakes, or desserts of any kind had heavy notes of butter in their overall taste. At the time, fruity flavors like rhubarbs and blackberries had taken just a bit of a back seat, and instead, others grew, especially flavors like vanilla and pecan. Sock-it-to-me cakes took those two tried and tested pillars of cake making and mixed them with a cinnamon streusel in the center. What you had then was a deliciously tender, moist, and rich cake that was perfect in just about any season and easily available. In the 70s, they definitely had a very memorable run, but as America kept changing its tastes, this recipe went in the closet. Bourbon fruitcakes had their fair share of dried fruit goodness too, except it came with a boozy twist. All of the fruitcake would be soaked in bourbon. While the essential dish that involved just candied fruits was well known in most states, it really took off in Kentucky. Over there, each neighborhood had their own style of bourbon fruitcake. Some people would soak it in whiskey and top it with a bourbon glaze. Others would keep the glaze but replace the whiskey with vanilla crumb frosting and use sponge cake. So you see, the idea got around and people had their fun with it. That just goes to show the boundless imagination of man to us, really, because we could not think of mixing bourbon with vanilla. However, even in states like that, this is mostly a very antique 70s dish that is not popular anymore. Speaking of baker bangers that had boozy beginnings, grasshopper cakes were meant to mimic the taste of a grasshopper cocktail and were actually a pretty refreshingly new dish. People had options for cakes, do not get us wrong, but you know the menu on your phone can suddenly start to look stale when it has the same 6 things you have always ordered. since like the past 5 months, and that is when cakes like this were people's new way to feel good about themselves on a Friday night. Grasshopper cakes had mint cakes that were layered with chocolate fudge and topped with mint whipped cream. It was not only really popular in general for bakeries, but also a holiday favorite. There would always be sales going on for grasshopper cakes with 10 or 20% off. Nowadays, you would not find this anywhere because mint cakes are not very trendy right now. You could always try making it at home, but an authentic 70s grasshopper was something else. Here's one that has a bit of a controversy on it depending on where you are from. The Italian cream cake did really well in the South. Pretty much every neighborhood had it up for dinner at Thanksgiving or some kind of holiday. Maybe their kid just passed an entrance test, or maybe they got a lease on that house they have been planning to move into. Point being, any reason was mostly a good reason to have an Italian cream cake. Outside the South, people sort of questioned the cream cheese frosting and had their reservations. Critics could not see how almonds and pecans could work together in a dish with coconuts as a base, especially with a frosting like that, but it was definitely still a presence in the baking scene in 1970s America. Back then, it had a niche following, and enough time has passed for that to have faded away long ago, so no one really remembers a legit Italian cream cake now. Do not get the wrong idea, because Americans have no real problem with cream cheese frosting, and cakes like hummingbird cakes prove that. Hummingbird cakes were a deeply beloved 3-layered cake with a very smooth and buttery cream cheese frosting. Bananas, pineapples, pecans, and brown sugar were also used but contained in different layers. Due to the way it was structured with each section having a unique taste, the cake sold heaps. If you ever have had one, by the way, remember to thank Jamaica for doing the US a favor and giving us the recipe. They actually did it to promote tourism to Jamaica, so we guess it is a win-win situation. Despite having peaked in the 70s and being largely gone by the 90s, it was still known as the most wanted recipe in Southern Living's recipe in 1990. If you do not know, that magazine was and is a pretty big deal for chefs. Atlanta has given us some great things like Donald Glover's hit Atlanta series, and also one beloved soda, which led to another cherished cake, the Coca-Cola cake. It involved a thick buttermilk chocolate cake and marshmallows which were topped with a cola frosting. Unusually, the cake was frosted while still being warm. You may think this is a dumpster fire of an idea and it tastes terrible, but you would be sorely wrong. In fact, most people were not able to tell Coke was even used in the cake. Talk about sneaky, huh? Honestly, the closest thing we can compare it to is a sheath cake, which has a similar recipe but a few things left out. Coca-Cola cakes were perhaps the best Southern comfort food on many, many nights, but people would eventually move on as different products and mixes came. Mayonnaise cake kept steering America into the direction of adding weird things to chocolate cakes and discovering later that they actually do work together. Mayonnaise cakes were these really moist, dense chocolate cakes that were not soft but heavy to bite. One of the best things to come out of Depression-era cuisine are cakes like this that require no basic ingredients like eggs or butter but can still be a knockout all on their own. Every underdog deserves to shine, you know? And mayonnaise cakes definitely had a very bright light. You cannot even taste the mayonnaise in the final product, and the additional topping of chocolate buttercream makes the whole experience a dreamy, solid 10. In our book, that is reason enough to get the baking gloves on and start the oven. But unfortunately, this stayed in the 70s, and people preferred cakes made with more ingredients when times got better. If we are talking about what was popping the Depression, then it would be criminal to not mention Wacky Cake. Again, a very dark and vivid cake in terms of flavor that could be frosted with any icing you preferred. The best part about this dish is that you can bake the cake in the same pan in which you make the mix, so it is all a very simple and easy process. An insanely high part of the population wanted comfort food, but everything they would use to make that was so out of reach in those times. Things like Wacky Cakes, which, despite how they went against traditional baking conventions, provided a lot of warmth and relief to people. If it looks like it and it tastes like, then really, what is the problem? Sadly, most Depression-era cooking stayed in that period. Earthquake cakes are not made from innovation born of scarcity. No, on the contrary, many critics and crowds were of the opinion that it often did too much. Similarly, for people who loved explosive combinations of flavors that bounced off of each other, this was Nirvana. A chocolate mix base for the cake layered and filled with coconuts, pecans, and chocolate chips, as well as topped with cream cheese and chocolate batter. Yeah, that definitely sounds like a lot. We love our sweets just as much as the next person, but at some point it stings, you know? Despite facing some not-so-welcoming reviews here and there, earthquake cakes were pretty common in tropical seasons, particularly in states like Hawaii and Florida. Definitely a cake that is a bit too all over the place to have lasted the long haul, though. Raspberry Bavarian cakes were the pearl of any feast, with all eyes firmly glued to the cake's shine and noses pointed towards its ethereal aroma. You know when something passes you by and suddenly you forget the time and the conversation you were having? Your head just gets locked onto whatever whiff of magic just passed you by. People would often describe their first up-close contact with raspberry Bavarian cakes that way. Beautiful, but even tastier. They had a fluffy and melty crème anglaise base that had been folded multiple times in whipped cream. Raspberry Bavarian cakes were in cookbooks and magazines all over the nation in the 70s, and they were a way to make a statement, or to have one wedding cake you would not forget. We are definitely jealous of those who got to try a slice when it was in its prime. Mocha whip cakes were more so the next hot thing in 1978 and started out as a niche trend particular in French-American restaurants. Young adults, book readers, and the romanticizing cafe-going types would always order a slice with their coffee of the day. Gold does not stay hidden in the dumpster for too long most times, and for these whip cakes that was the case. Mocha whip cakes went mainstream when more magazines began featuring them in the breakfast sections as chic and classy breakfast for the modern working adult. Advertising can go a long way, especially when it is targeted at you with the intent of making you feel special, but eating this cake did feel special. In America, it was hard for coffee lovers to find a coffee chocolate cake that did it right, and this was it. You can imagine the grief they had when it stopped being served in the usual spots past the 70s. Cherry chiffon cakes hit a sweet spot for almost every American, whether under or over the age of 30, in both their worst and best times. An incredibly cloud-like cake that almost felt like biting into squishy air makes for therapeutic release, apparently. Cherry chiffons worked in any mood and situation. Getting married? Got your diploma? Had a baby? Moving out or celebrating a promotion? Won your divorce settlement? Whatever it was, this cherry-topped cake was there to make the sweet taste of it all even sweeter. Bakeries would usually sell these at pretty affordable rates too, so it was not anything that broke the bank if you ordered it. Heck, it was popular enough that it was a regular order every other day at most places. Those days are gone now, and Americans find that kind of personal comfort in much more different things today. Devil's food cake sounds incredibly intimidating and extra, and we would not blame you for thinking so. Maybe you are picturing a triple-layered behemoth of a cake adorned with skulls and a three-headed dog. What you will actually get if you step in a bakery and ask for, "This is a dark chocolate cake," but not just any old chocolate cake. Devil's foot cakes used to distinguish themselves in many ways from the standard. One of those was that they used much less butter and used more baking soda, giving it that classic mouth-watering look. Also, this helped for a much stronger flavor. Layers of deep, dark chocolate that took an idea as old as men skipping stones on a river to new peaks no one thought it could reach. Just goes to show there may be a lot more treasure if you look a little deeper. No matter how deep we looked, though, we could not find a place that does a great 70s-style devil's foot. Lazy Daisy cakes were made from sponge cakes, particularly hot milk ones, and would always come with a heaping serving of broiled frosting. Sometimes they were called snacking cakes, which tells you all you need to know about the cake. People had a very love-love relationship with Lazy Daisies, and as the name implies, it made them not want to get out of bed. A buttery yellow vanilla cake that was laced with broiled frosting was very hard to beat, and tropical elements like coconut flakes made it all the more refreshing. The frosting could be a vanilla one, but most traditional community cookbook recipes had a coconut and butter topping. Lazy Daisy cakes, true to their name, were easy to whip up in minutes and had you seated in one place for hours, slowly devouring every last slice. It is a crying shame that those are very far away comfort days from now. Pineapple pudding cakes were also just as easy to make, and the perfect thing to freshen you up on a hot summer day. If you did not feel like pulling out all the stops and making a pudding and cake from the start, you could always use packaged products. Pillsbury sugar cake mixes and instant pudding mixes achieved almost the same effect, really. It makes sense why this cake lasted a lot longer than others, because when a recipe is easy to make with grocery mart substitutes instead of proper ingredients, the crowds are going to love it. After all, it makes the dish really accessible to everybody. When people think of easy to buy and make cakes, they think of your typical chocolate cake. Pineapple pudding cakes, also yellow cakes, were mixed with pineapple juice and cream cheese vanilla fillings. Definitely one of the most revitalizing vintage cakes that we are sad to see gone. 7-Up cakes were these really fluffy and moist bundt cakes, or sometimes pound cakes, that started off in the 50s but really took off around 1970. You might remember the Coca-Cola cake earlier on this list, and hey, if one of them works, why not try all of those fizzy sodas? Baking cakes with sodas became a pretty common trend in the South, especially in places like Southern California, where they were childhood memories for many kids. Quick, easy, and cheap but delicious cakes that warmed your heart up with a nostalgia trip. In the taste department, these closely resembled lemon lime cake, but the use of 7-Up gave it a much more vibrant and bubblier texture. Baking and fizzy sodas were something people moved on from as the 21st century approached, sadly, and we do not really know if it was for the better. We are going to end the list with a show-stealing pound cake known as the Bishop's Cake. Extremely popular in many high-profile cookbooks, such as the Silver Palette Cookbook, this butter pound cake delivered a very vibrant and fruity punch to your taste buds. Most bundt cakes at the time came saturated with alcohol-based syrups. However, Bishop's cakes would instead focus on a much thicker and flavorful glaze. Also, in our opinion, anything that leaves a solid vanilla aftertaste in your mouth is an instant buy. While the trend of fruitcakes was still popular and rising in America, these cakes certainly dominated the wave. Everything has a beginning and an end, though, and Bishop cakes met theirs when more traditional vanilla sponge and frosting cakes replaced fruitcakes as the new baking MVP. Which cake would you prefer out of all the cakes from the 1970s? If you liked watching the video, be sure to give us a like and subscribe.